Oh, there we are. Hello, hello, Toronto. Good to see you all. It's a bit far in the back, but that's all right. First time in town. Love it so far. Effective data collection in Vue. So we've heard a lot of great talks. Shout out to all the other presenters today. So who am I? What am I doing here? I'm Rijk van Zanten, a Dutch-born and raised developer, now living in Brooklyn, New York City. I started as a user experience designer, so you might notice that a lot of this gets a bit UX heavy, and got into front-end development, shortly after. I've worked on data-driven apps, websites ranging from, local schools back in the day to Fortune 500 companies for well over a decade at this point. And while doing so, I started working on a content management system to help me power those projects. I've since joined forces with Ben Haynes, now our CEO, to create what has turned into sort of a back-end tool builder that is powering tens of thousands of websites and apps all over the planet. Directus. Shout out to your shirt, John. You know who you are. Next to working on Directus, I also teach typography and interaction at the Parsons School of Design in New York City. I also happen to be the guy who was shouted earlier by Chris. Shout out to Chris. Because I gave a slide on perceived performance in New Orleans back in the year. So thanks, Chris. So, dear what now? Directus specifically, backend platform, meaning you can use it for a wide variety of data-driven use cases, website content management, customer relations management, product inventory, basically all of the boring stuff around data, right? So think effectively of the best part of a backend as a service mixed to the best parts of a content management system. It's very API heavy, ships with the REST, GraphQL, WebSockets APIs to interact with that data. And then, main reason we're here, a data studio that's fully built in Vue, soon to be next, quick shout out, to help technical, but also your non-technical users manage that data. So we've learned lots of things doing this, and we've learned them the hard way, so I figured we'd share some of the things we've learned. Because it turns out building a backend platform like this is surprisingly tricky. There's loads of edge cases, there's a lot of different types of users, so every single design decision that you make and every technical decision has to be made with a lot of care. So modern Vue-based web apps, Directus included, they're dealing with a lot of data. You're tracking user clicks, you're having purchase history, tracking cart state, app has data flowing throughout. Shout out to Eduardo for that great talk on state management and fetching data as well. So while we often, as front-end developers, focus on using data to render out our applications, make it that output, data collection, so the input side, becomes equally critical when you're in a production environment. Because basically all production apps, at some point, sooner or later, have to deal with some sort of data collection. Even if you're building, limited interactivity pages or static websites, there's still going to be data collection. So in my especially earlier agency experience, this oftentimes felt like a bit of an oversight, which is weird, because there's a lot to consider when it comes to, effective but also ethical data collection. So now that we're here all together as Vue developers, I just wanted to take a closer look at sort of this second half of user interaction and user experience and allow your apps to evolve and remain useful over time. So I want to take some time exploring the types of data that we're collecting usually, what sort of methods we have available to us, and how we do so responsibly and also ethically in the context of Vue. So what is data, really? So the word itself means tons of different things to tons of different people, but that being said, when it comes to data collection, sort of data you're collecting in, there's a couple of common categories that I've seen come back over and over again. For example, you got personal information, somebody's name, email, phone number, login credentials, etc. You would use it for accounts, contact info. You got preferences, the theme, you want to light, dark, what's the user's language, what are their time zone, how do they want to customize your app? You got behavioral data, this is a little bit more analytical, page views, user sessions, click patterns, navigation paths, etc. Used for A/B testing, experience optimization, things like that. You got technical data, think device type, browser version. You got marketing data, how well is my campaign doing? Are the advertisements being clicked on the way I want to? Are people subscribing to emails? Transactional information, I basically group everything e-commerce in this bucket. Used for sales analytics, inventory management, that sort of thing. Communication data, what happens if you have support tickets or some other sort of messaging system, For things like sentiment analysis, you got location data, it gets a bit more specific now. GPS or based on the Wi-Fi, where is somebody physically? And a bit less common, obviously, but you got biometric data as well coming in, like heart rate, fingerprint, what happens, facial recognition for security potentially. So this is already a pretty long list, and I'm sure there's a bunch more that I haven't mentioned even yet here. But that being said, all of this data feels like you can really consolidate it down to two main methods of data collection. So you got active data collection, and you got passive data collection. So active data collection is your end user explicitly providing you the information and data, whereas passive data collection is data that you're either automatically generating or capturing based on user actions or system events or something else. So I want to use this session to really see what that active and passive data collection looks like in the real world by sort of the most common use case for each. So first and foremost, you might have seen it coming, forms. Because basically, almost all active data collection ends up in some form of form, if you will. From login screens, signing up for newsletters, making a purchase, or even submitting messages to a help desk, forms are just everywhere. Right? They're a critical part of how our users interact with the apps that we build. However, building forms is never just as easy as throwing together a couple of input fields and a submit button. A poorly done form hurts a lot more than it helps. Could even alienate or frustrate your end user. Never a good experience. So while we don't have enough time to dive in all of the ins and outs of forms in the session here, because really that is a whole 6-week workshop elsewhere, I do want to touch on a handful of the common pitfalls and best practices that I've seen from building directives so we can all create forms that are a little bit more functional, accessible, and also user-friendly. So first and foremost, when building forms, the first rule to me, at least keep them as simple as possible, right? Overloading your end user with way too many fields can be overwhelming, can cause them to abandon that data input. Not good. So ask yourself, do I really need all of the information that I'm asking for at the point in this flow that I'm asking them for? And sort of obvious, easy example there is like when you have a newsletter sign up. Are you going to ask somebody's name, their preference, which lists they want to subscribe to, when you want it to start, etc., or is just an email address enough, right? When you do need all of the information at once, just make sure you break it down into smaller bite-sized pieces. Avoid chaotic page layouts for your end user. For example, when I first moved to the United States a couple of years back, I was faced with the following horrendous user experience nightmare for the first time when tax season rolled around. Shock and awe, this. I don't know what things look like on this side of the border. No experience with it yet. Probably keep it that way. But it was quite the culture shock for me coming from the Netherlands originally. Now, obviously, this example here is a paper form, so their ability to solve some of the user experience problems digitally or through interaction is a bit limited. It doesn't stop me from using it as a learning opportunity, right? So for example, there's inputs here unrelated to the goal of the form. There's something about an election campaign. I have no idea what it means. There's multiple choice options that require sort of knowledge of what the option even means. Like there's things on there with abbreviations, like I have no idea what it means. There's a lot of questions on there that even tell you, look at the instructions, because you will probably mess it up. There's manual calculations I'm supposed to do, but really, worst of all of this, you have to fill it out no matter what. And if you fill it out wrong, not good. Very bad. It's impossible. So what can we do to fix this? Well, within the US, a lot of companies are fixing it and lobbying real hard for the government not to fix it. But just as a bit of a counterpoint, what I was used to before is there's just an app, right? There's a government-built and provided app that just does this on your behalf. First off, you securely log in with a bit of biometrics, right? So that is one of those data collection categories. All of the different pieces of information that you have to fill out are sort of grouped by section. So it kind of creates, a stepper-like experience so you know exactly where you are. Everything is pre-filled. I think this is just mind-bogglingly much better. Cannot stress how big of a quality of life improvement that is. So therefore, from an end-user perspective, I log in. I just have to check the numbers, make sure that nothing stands out as completely wrong, or just make sure that it matches my records. Hit a button, and it just shows me what I owe or what I get back. That's it. Nice and easy, right? So the exact same problem is being solved. I did my tax filings. The exact same information is gathered at the end of the day, right? But in a way that, for me as a user, is not just a frustrating, expensive nightmare. It's just done, click of a button. Also, quick shout out to a speaker of tomorrow morning, Marcus. I hope I don't butcher your name, because I believe he's fighting the good fight here, working on similar areas for the Austrian government. So make sure to catch his talk tomorrow as well about improving Nuxt tests. So long story short, keep your form simple and your users happy, right? Especially important if a form is required and can have potentially destructive side effects. So in case of the text example, if I do it wrong, big bad, not good. So make sure you design your form for the format it appears in as well. And maybe, if at all possible, consider changing what that format is. Maybe a mobile app is better than a desktop environment. Maybe a paper form is the best way to go at the end of the day. It depends. Build for the most common user flow first. I feel like this is one that I often see go wrong, even within the context of directives, which is you're trying to include way too many options and things, and therefore you're overwhelming everybody. So therefore, scale it down. Focus on that sort of happy flow first for the majority of your user base, and then deprioritize some of the power user stuff. Still make it available, mind you, but just get it out of the way for the people that generally don't need it. Know where you're asking every question. Know why every input is there. Take a second to ask yourself, what are we doing here? That's something I like throwing into most meetings. What are we even doing here? What is the point? What are we trying to achieve before we add a bunch more options and inputs? So a quick shout out to a good resource for this. The United Kingdom government, bit of a weird source for design resources, but it's actually tremendously good, have some incredibly good do's and don'ts for structuring pages and focusing on the user experience. So if you haven't checked out some of their work yet, I would highly recommend, pull up the Gov UK website and scroll through their design resources. All right, second up, validation and feedback. Most users, especially with text forms, need a little bit of guidance to avoid making errors and help complete the form successfully. It gets a little bit more, it depends-y on what you're working on, but generally speaking, you'd want to educate them ahead of time instead of, making them go through the same form multiple times. If they already know what they're supposed to do, less chance of making errors. When something does inevitably go wrong, make sure, A, the end user knows what's expected of them. Feels like a bit of an obvious one. But if at all possible, tell them how to fix it rather than what's wrong, right? So instead of saying invalid email address, just say something like, make sure to use a valid domain or something like that. But if at all possible, try to, avoid people from entering, or sort of try to prevent people from entering the wrong thing in the first place. So I think you see a lot in inputs is input masking. There's some libraries in this case. I use PrimeView as an example that have some pre-built components and other methods to help with sort of input masking. That being said, still be careful that you're not erroneously breaking things like password managers or some other autofill tools, right? So for some of these inputs, if they're not executed properly, and again, that's a very tricky thing to do well, it could easily break, assistive technologies like that. That being said, I like to err on the side of flexibility on the client side, make it a bit more open-ended, and handle the variations on the server if at all possible. For example, if you're requesting a phone number, depending on where you are in the world, there could be all sorts of punctuation in there, right? So I'm now living in the US, so there's parentheses, and there's spaces, and there's dashes, and all that kind of stuff. If all you need at the end of the day is just a number, those are things we can easily strip out server-side, right? It doesn't necessarily matter if the user on the front end enters it with all of that punctuation or without, it doesn't matter. Like we can standardize that at the server side. So the end result is then the exact same, but the user experience is going to be better because they can just enter, their data in a format that makes sense to them, right? Rather than having to force them into the mold for your form. Third up for active data collection forms, mobile first. The people that have the pleasure/displeasure of working with me or being in my class, they've heard me say this many times. This keynote, no different. When you are working on forms, especially ones that are a little bit more involved or just generally have a lot of stuff going on, like different sections, it's very easy to accidentally build it just for the wider canvas that you have on desktop, and then it just doesn't work, right? A mobile design is always usable on desktop, but never the other way around. Like this is an actual website I'm actually supposed to use for actually planning office hours at school. I just don't, is the end result, right? I just Slack somebody instead. I was like, let's do it at this time because I cannot for the life of me deal with this. So again, start with mobile first, expand it for the larger screens instead of the other way around, right? All right, last and then certainly not least, the elephant in the room, and hopefully the thing you were already screaming when you saw forms coming in, accessibility. Was that an obvious one? I hope that was an obvious one, right? Okay, good. It is, I think, the hardest aspect of forms to get just right. It is also the aspect that goes wrong the most often. There's obviously some visual accessibility pitfalls that apply here as well. Things like color contrast, small click targets, and labeled fields. Things that are generally easier to spot. But to me, the way harder problems resolve around keyboard usage and screen reader support. So while Vue makes it trivially easy to hook up your data, your refs, to input elements in the browser, it actually gets surprisingly difficult to do a good form from scratch in modern web development, especially once you're dealing with non-browser standard things like custom drop-downs, or input types that aren't natively supported. The earlier input masking, I think, is a pretty good example of this, right? Input masking doesn't really exist in the browser by default yet. Who knows, maybe one day. But that does mean that if you're going to implement that from scratch, there's a lot of additional things to think about. As with everything else in web development, good foundational accessibility makes your work better for all of the users, right? It's good enough for most, and we'll figure out the last couple of percent later. Now, if it's good from the start, good foundational accessibility is going to help everybody else. Because even in the input masking example, if you break my password manager, I'm going to be mad. It's very annoying. So while there's tools and tests available to help improve accessibility on forms, there is a little bit of an easier cheat, way to success. Just don't build forms at all. Instead, rely on browser natives whenever you can, or use an off-the-shelf form building library. So I called out two good ones over here. You have FormKit on the left, I believe. Yeah, and ViewForm on the right. These folks work, day and night making good forms for a living, and they're going to be a hell of a lot more accessible just out of the box. So I'm really trying to say here, try not to reinvent a square wheel, right? All right, so now that we know what to watch out for when it comes to active data collection, let's take a little peek behind the curtain and a behind-the-scenes look at the other side of the house, which is passive data collection. So, whereas most active data collection is oftentimes handled through some sort of form, large or small, passive data collection comes in various shapes and sizes. Some are client-side, some are server-side, some are both. It could be all sorts of things. For the sake of example, though, and with an eye on the clock here, I figured it'd be a good idea to take a look at probably the most common one here, which is behavioral analytics. Bit of a scary topic, but an important one. So that's the collection, analyzing, and interpreting of how individuals behave within your app that you already built. Main focus there, hopefully for most, is understanding the actions, decisions, and interactions of your end user. Try to uncover the patterns and insights you can use to then optimize those experiences. Inform your future roadmap. What do you want to focus on next? Or inform every other business decision, really. Most people default to some sort of third-party tracking software out of the box, myself included. Quick show of hands here. Who's using a Google Analytics or an alternative of the sorts in their apps or websites? Well, it's a bit of a, obvious one. Most of you. Same here. I'll be honest, especially back when I was working at agencies, it was incredibly common for me to just get a little snippet of JavaScript flung over the fence from some other stakeholder at some point that is like, just put this on the page and we'll never talk about it again. I bet money here that most, for folks that raise their hands, I'm sure that sounds a little bit familiar. You just get some sort of snippet that injects something Google or HubSpot or Salesforce or whatever else. Now, there's a good reason why we're using off-the-shelf software for this kind of stuff, because just as with forms, it is very difficult to implement it the right way, sort of, at scale, especially in production scale. That being said, even though we as front-end developers here might not be directly involved in the decision-making process for some of these tools, I would still urge you to ask yourself and your team, and whoever tells you to just shove it up and do it, the following. Like, what are we actually doing? This is the same question I said at forums, right? I say it all the time. What are we trying to do? What data do we actually need to get out of this? Because some of these tools can be fairly invasive by default and operate under a sort of, let's collect everything first, and then we'll figure out what to do with that information later. But that in turn, can negatively affect your app quite drastically, either in sort of pervasive tracking or sort of ethical concerns, but also performance, right? If this thing is now tracking every single click and every user path everywhere, it's just not good for performance. Do we really need to know somebody's physical location for what we want to do with the data? Do we need to follow somebody around the internet so we know what other websites they visited? Do we really need to know who the individual is in the first place? All questions important to ask. Another side effect of the whole collect everything first and figure it out later and ask questions later approach is that you can easily overwhelm yourself and your team and whoever else has to deal with this data, right? Ask yourself, how much of this stuff do we need at a given time? So for example, if you're tracking user clips in an app, user clicks, apologies, to learn what type of flows you're going through in your app, and you were to do that across, 10,000 active users, are you prepared for these millions and millions and millions of data points? Like, are you actually going to do something with them? Or are they going to disappear in a spreadsheet somewhere to never to be seen? Who needs to know? Once you know what data you're tracking and collecting, and you have a large pile of it somewhere, you should ask yourselves, who should have access to this data? Especially if you're dealing, with some private data, personal identifiable information, things like that. Who in your team should have access to this? But also, what third-party vendors do you trust with this stuff? And this is oftentimes, at least in my experience, I never even thought about it twice. I was like, oh yeah, I'll just use Google Analytics, done. But now that I'm thinking about it, do I want all of that stuff to be at Google? It's a black box as far as I know, right? Will they ever use that data for their own purposes outside of my knowledge or consent? Like if they're AI training or something, is that going to go against my data? I don't know. There's no way to know, right? Is there a way to self-host some of this stuff so we know it's within control? Questions to ask. Last but not least, and hopefully just with accessibility for forms, this is a bit of an obvious one, but should we collect some of this stuff in the first place? This question kind of should be top of mind with all of the other questions as well, and just always in general, but it's, is it even ethical to get some of this stuff? Like, is it legal to get this information, especially if you're dealing with, users in Europe and you're facing GDPR reasons, or you're in California and you have the CCPA? Is it ethical? Is it legal? Do we feel good about it? Now, this gets a little hand wave and a little user experience-y, but what would your user feel like if they knew you were tracking all this stuff? Would they be okay with it, or does it feel weird? Reflect it to yourself. If you knew that other things that you use were tracking the same thing you're not proposing on you, would that make you uncomfortable? And if the answer is yes, then why would you do it with somebody else, right? When choosing a vendor for passive data collection needs, be it analytics or observability or error tracking, shout out to Sentry earlier, or even when you get told to include a snippet from, for some service by somebody else, even if it's a manager or a different team, I just say be critical, right? Be critical. Okay, so with an eye on the clock, I won't go too much over it. What have we really learned of any of this? I know it's been a bit more theoretical. I tend to do that. I think it's probably the user experience side of me. Keep it simple. For both the forms, active data collection and passive data collection, I'd always urge you, start small. Start small. Keep it simple. Everybody will be better for it. Learn what you're doing with that information, learn what your user is doing with those forms, and expand over time. I've seen it happen too many times where I'm working on a client website back in the agency days. They just want to have analytics because it's important. You set them up with basically, here's a pool of everything, and nobody ever looks at it ever again because it's overwhelming as hell and nobody knows what to look at, right? So first get together, figure out, okay, what are the metrics that we actually want to see? What are the graphs that we want to look at? Who is looking at them? When are they going to be looking at them? And then figure out what's the right tool for the job. Don't reinvent that wheel if you can prevent it, especially when you find yourself implementing more hyper-specific custom form elements, drop-downs with snazzy bits, or some of this tracking stuff. Just consider using existing tooling so you just don't accidentally wreck the accessibility of performance of your app. This is a mistake I made myself like 5 years ago, and Judd is now paying the price for it. Thank you. Be inquisitive. When you do end up using some of these tools, using some of these apps, ask the what's, the why's, the how's, the when's, the who's questions. Be critical. Last but not least, lesson learned the hard way. Don't build a CMS. Just don't do it. Just don't do it. I did it. I did it. I am doing it. Don't do it. Take it from me. I'll take one for the team on this one. Just don't do it. Take it from me. Don't do it. And with that being said, I want to say thank you very much for listening to me ramble for a little bit here. If you want to nerd out a bit more, you can find me on Blue Sky since recently under @Rijk.nyc. The rest of the internet is @Rijk van Zanten, is just my full name. Or check out Directus on directus.io. Thank you to all the great speakers for the rest of today. Hope you enjoy the great talks later today and tomorrow as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rijk. That was amazing. You triggered something for me as I experienced the combination of a passive form collection in the form of an active form recently. Felt real weird. We can talk about that later. We've got a couple minutes left. Let's leave space for one question out there. We got one in the back in the center.
Check. Hi, thanks for the talk. Do you have any tips for broaching this conversation on larger companies, particularly when you have demands from multiple sales, analytics teams, product teams? How do you go about navigating that conversation?
That is a tremendously good question. Thank you for that. In my experience, what has helped me the most is to make it as data-driven as I possibly can. So instead of just phrasing it as, hey, I'm flagging this as a concern because it doesn't vibe with what I think, like that one is an easy one to just get killed, as in he's just speaking up, just whatever. If there is some sort of objective backing you can find for whatever that particular conversation is, that has really given me the most success. So that could be a legal thing. It's like, hey, this is going to break GDPR. Hey, product team, I'm sure you're more scared of the legal team than I am. We probably shouldn't be doing this. Like that is just kills all, right? At the same time, if it gets a little bit more hand wavy or more feeling, that can be a bit more tricky. But that's where the design resources like gov.uk come in and could be a very good resource where you can say, well, I have an objective source from a party that is trusted that is doing this at scale, telling us that this is the wrong way to do it, right? Let's take it out of it's my opinion and into I am right because of the world. You can win those discussions.
Thank you.
One more in. Anybody else have a question? No. Okay, I have one for you because I was curious. You had a list of four the main points of what you want to include when you're properly actively collecting data, and I've seen throughout my career that a lot of times you talked about the agency world, like you get a lot of pressure to cut the corners. Often it's accessibility, but it could be a number of different things. And so what advice do you have for folks when they are experiencing a lot of pressure to just ship, even though you're not following all of these best practices? How do you push back on that?
Yeah, so what I've noticed that a lot of times when that pressure has happened to me, it's because that the person on the other end doesn't quite have the same definition of done that I have as the person implementing it, right? So the very first thing before even the project even starts is to make sure that you level set on, okay, what is the definition of done here? Like what are the must-haves, what are the should-haves, what are the could-haves? How do we expend it over time? What parts can we cut if time is at a crunch? Because if the other person, the enemy, if the person on the other side is already aware of like these are the must-haves ahead of time, it doesn't have to become a discussion at game time, right? It just becomes well, here's the checklist. We're 3 short, we're not done yet. And because we already agreed what the checklist was ahead of time, that should be less of an issue at that point.
Love that. All right, thank you. Big round of applause here for Rijk.